The theme for 2022 is reperception, which is actually a key characteristic of the work that futurists do. It's looking at signals in the present and thinking about them differently as they unfold. COVID has forced us to reperceive our situation, and we think that we're going to start seeing significant after effects of that in 2022.
Hallo und herzlich willkommen zu einer neuen Ausgabe von Handelsblatt Disrupt, dem Podcast über neue Ideen, Disruption und die Zukunft der Wirtschaft in der digitalen Welt. Mein Name ist Sebastian Matthes und ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich aus unserem Podcast-Studio hier in Düsseldorf. Heute hören Sie die letzte Ausgabe von Handelsblatt Disrupt in diesem sehr spannenden Jahr 2021. Und wir beschließen dieses Jahr natürlich mit einem Blick in die Zukunft. Zu Gast habe ich eine Frau, die nicht nur Bestseller geschrieben hat und einige der größten Unternehmen weltweit berät. Wenn sie auf Tech-Konferenzen wie der South by Southwest in Texas spricht, dann hören in der Regel abertausende Menschen zu. Es geht um die Futurologin Amy Webb, die seit vielen Jahren Szenarien für die wichtigsten technologischen Trends entwickelt. Ich spreche mit ihr über die Frage, wie die Pandemie die Welt verändert hat, was hinter dem Metaverse-Hype wirklich steckt, warum synthetische Biologie das nächste große Ding wird und wie ihr eine Zwangsstörung geholfen hat, ihren heutigen Job zu finden. Amy Webb ist die Gründerin des Future Today Instituts in New York. Sie ist Professorin an der NYU Stern School of Business und das Wirtschaftsmagazin Forbes hat sie als eine der 50 Frauen benannt, die die Welt wirklich verändern. Das wäre das alles noch nicht genug. Sie war auch schon einmal hier im Podcast zu Gast und die Folge damals im Jahr 2020 gehörte zu den am meisten gehörten Folgen des Jahres. Und damit gleich zu meinem Gast heute hier im Podcast, Amy Webb. Hello, Amy. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Amy, I think we are turning it into a great tradition that you are sharing your insights about the future with our listeners at least once a year. So great to have you back again. To those who don't know you yet, can you please tell us what exactly do you do? What exactly is a quantitative futurist?
Happy to tell you. So I'm a futurist, and my role is not to predict the future, but rather to make businesses and leaders prepared for whatever may be on the horizon. Mm-hmm. Now, the way that we do this is by using qualitative and quantitative data to identify emerging signals of change and to use pattern recognition to determine what signals are actually indicators of trends. Trends are important because they indicate movement over time. And in fact, the acronym that we use to qualify a trend is MOVE, M-O-V-E. Trends represent long-term movement to the future. So we're looking for a main need. A trend is driven by a main basic human need that tends to be catalyzed by emerging science and technology. Trends are ongoing. They're timely, but they persist over long periods of time. They represent vectors, intersecting vectors of sometimes disconnected weak signals that are emerging. And finally, trends are evolving. They tend to emerge as they evolve over time. They're not static. And that's very important because I think so many organizations mistake what is trendy in the moment for what is actually a long-term trend. That shifts the way that business and society and governing function. And yeah, we use those trends to model scenarios, and we have a fairly involved process to do that. And these scenarios are strategic. And at the end, we rehearse the futures, meaning we're either looking at probabilities, which potential scenario is likely to unfold, or we're preparing people who have to make decisions to be prepared and to have the right knowledge and experience for uncertainty and volatility on the horizon.
Yeah, that's great. We are going to talk about lots of these scenarios and signals today. But before we going to do that, I would like to talk about the pandemic. Last time we spoke, it was actually at the beginning of the pandemic. I think it was around April 2020. So we talked a little bit how the world might change in the coming months and years. So let's look back. How has the world actually changed since then? And what are the most obvious or maybe non-obvious things Corona has changed?
Well, I think maybe the the biggest and least intuitive thing that has changed is our willingness to lean into uncertainty. We're actually on year 3, going into year 3 now of the coronavirus, of COVID-19. And, I think there was a lot of resistance at the very beginning to try to stop what was happening or return to what life used to be like. These were Sisyphean tasks, that every time somebody tried to or made a promise to stop the pandemic in its tracks, it was pretty obvious that was only going to lead to even more headache down the road. So I think we are in a position now where we're more willing to deal with uncertainty. And I think that's been a good thing.
It is, because we become more resilient, right?
I think so. I think if we're able to look back to this moment in time, what I'm hoping is that we're developing habits now that will serve us into the future, that we're willing to be a little bit less static in our thinking, which is a good thing, that we're more flexible.
That's pretty optimistic, but is there also something that has changed that scares you?
Yeah, so, and I wouldn't say it's optimistic. Listen, we're very likely to swing back in a different direction, but at least for now, I think it's good to be flexible in your thinking. It makes you more prepared and resilient, when you cannot control all the changes that are happening. Now, what else has happened? We've got the launch of genetic databases, national genetic databases, privately held genetic databases. There's an awful lot of our information floating around, and we have zero understanding of who actually has access to this. We've got, on the one hand, new hybrid work policies, which I think is good in a lot of cases. But we also have rising calls for unionization, especially at big tech companies, in the wake of pandemic-related changes. And certainly those technology companies were not ready for the wave of worker organizing that we're seeing. On the one hand, we've got telehealth that in a lot of countries didn't exist because of regulation prior to the pandemic and is now accessible, which means theoretically that more people have access in an easier way to healthcare. But on the flip side of that, the pandemic highlighted that many communities, everywhere, including in mature economies, there are lots of people that don't have high-speed broadband. And so the access to telemedicine is terrific, but if you can't get online, then that access doesn't really help you. So I think the other issue is that the pandemic really has revealed quite a number of contradictions that are yet unresolved as we head into this third year of the pandemic.
Especially in Germany, we have seen that our digital infrastructure is not really up to what it should be in these days. So,
which is surprising. I think that's another important point that you just made, because I think outsiders would look at Germany and just assume that everybody everywhere in the country is on blazing fast, internet, and everybody is hyper connected. And some might look at the United States and think the same thing. In both of our countries, the pandemic revealed what the big gaps are and that they still exist.
I'm always wondering what actually went wrong. Why did this happen to the US, to Germany, Europe?
Planning. I mean, it's the same answer to any time somebody asks the question, what went wrong? Invariably, the answer is always a lack of planning and foresight. I mean, it's the bottom line.
Is that actually something China can do better? We come to China later, but on this point, is planning better in China?
So China has a history of what are called 5-year plans, and they've just unveiled their 14th 5-year plan. And these are government-led strategic plans that fit into a broader vision for what the country is attempting to achieve. In the past, a lot of those 5-year plans never really took off. There were a lot of unmet goals and expectations, but under Xi Jinping, that is very much not the case. There's a pretty high level of execution on these plans. And one of the things involved in these plans is national 5G. So China is in the process of rolling out 5G nationwide. And in the past year alone, there was a staggering increase in the number of people that came online. It was more than 500%. And it's not because they were starting at zero, right? So this isn't a statistical anomaly. This is just China is bulldozing ahead fast to connect everybody in the country to high-speed internet.
Right. So before we dig deeper into the tech trends of 2022, I think it's interesting to take a quick look at your life story. Early on, you studied classical clarinet. You worked as a journalist in Japan, and you speak Japanese, if I remember correctly. You're teaching at universities in New York and Oxford. You're writing books, and you're consulting Fortune 500 companies. You're married, and you have kids, and you have OCD, which is stands for Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, which in German is a Zwangsstörung. So how did all of that feed into what you're doing today?
Well, let's see if I can summarize quickly. You're right. I started actually piano when I was 4 and classical guitar when I was 5, and picked up clarinet when I was in 6th grade. And by the time I was in high school, I played all woodwind instruments, all but double reeds. So I think, and I never actually wanted to become a musician. I just, I guess, excelled at music. And I had received a invitation to a pretty prestigious music conservatory with a scholarship when I was about 14 years old. So I never had to really audition. I think all of those years in music was about both leveraging something I do naturally, which is pattern recognition, and helping me really train and think about sort of atomic units of information, whether that's a note or a phrase, and figuring out how to think many steps ahead. I think that skill is still in use today, although I don't play. I dropped out of music school. It was
you don't play at all anymore?
I play for myself. I had some performance anxiety issues. I was just miserable, and I stopped playing because I started having panic attacks, and it wasn't, I just hated it. I hated everything about it. So now, every now and then I play for fun. I've started to take some lessons again, but there's no pressure to perform. Anyhow, I think that connects to the speech and debate, the forensics that I did in college afterwards, which is all about thinking on your feet and reading and researching enormous amounts of information. And the journalism, again, was about deep research and asking a lot of questions. I mean, I think all of these different parts of my life are part of a long continuum. And yeah, the obsessive compulsive disorder, which I now know I've had for years and I've been in treatment for. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes, it's not something that I have to manage it every day, but it's not debilitating anymore like it used to be. But I think that all of these things together are what enable me to do my work. So I guess it's a good thing that I like what I do.
So that's interesting. So how did especially OCD impact your decision to become a quantitative futurist, or did it not have anything to do with that?
Oh, no, it had a lot to do with it. So in the United States, the thing that I always wanted to do was be a lawyer. I wanted to practice the type of law that leads to the Supreme Court. And I took the exam to get into law school, and there are 3 parts to that exam. The first 2 parts, I scored a perfect score, logic and reasoning and analytics. And then on the 3rd part of the exam, which is reading comprehension, I had a panic attack, and I had to leave. I wasn't in treatment yet, so I didn't really have the tools to cope with what was happening. And there was no way to retake the test. If I did, it was going to average out the scores. So anyhow, I didn't go to law school. Journalism happened as kind of an accident, and I liked journalism, but I, at some point, was much more interested in how newspapers were going to survive in the future rather than just writing stories for the newspaper. I heard that there was this profession called, futures work. My academic background is game theory and economics. That's what I was studying in order to get into law school. And anyhow, all the pieces fit together, and that was I guess, 18 years ago.
Great. What was the moment when you thought, okay, this could actually become a job, a career for me?
Well, once I started doing this work, I just got very, very busy very quickly. And again, I think on paper, the work that I do today really makes use of all of my skills and all the experience that I've had over the years, and also what I would consider to be my neurodiversity. I think the OCD, I figured out a way to make the OCD into a power rather than a disability.
Mm-hmm. In what way?
Sometimes my mind will automatically invent rules, or it will assume patterns are there. And one of the things that I've had to learn how to do is check my own biases. Sometimes it's also why I think I'm pretty good at scenarios. My mind immediately wanders into horrific. Like, I don't need to go to sleep to have a nightmare. I'm perfectly capable of inventing horrific things.
Right.
So now that I know how to channel that, when I'm working with a financial institution on risk, for example, like future risk that they've never imagined, I can find, I will come up with reasons that they should be concerned that they've never even considered, that will keep them up at night. And that's good because it means that they have the opportunity to be prepared. And the OCD side of me is, if we're trying to look for new growth opportunities or, innovation roadmaps for a company, my mind, I will keep going and going and going and going. And if anything, the real challenge we have is prioritizing. So again, I think these are really strengths.
That's great. So let's use these strengths a little bit and talk about next year, and maybe with a broader view. So what will be the bigger headline for 2022? What will maybe historians write about this awesome year 2022 that is about to start?
I think that there are probably a couple of broad areas that we will think about when we think about this year 2022. One big headline has to do with space. There's a show that I've been watching called The Expanse, which is on in the US. And if you're at all interested in science fiction and space, it's probably one of the best shows I've ever seen. And I remember watching it just after Blue Origin took William Shatner, Captain Kirk, off planet, and getting chills and thinking, this I think is the beginning. I really do think that our future generations of people 300, 400, 500 years into the future will look back at us right now as the originators of what's about to unfold. We're going to see an unprecedented number of satellite launches. There are private space stations. The space economy is growing. And although that may feel detached from what most businesses are doing from the day to day, I really do think that there are knock-on effects and also just social implications. So space is going to be big. I think also synthetic biology, which I can certainly talk about, but has to do with, at the very least, the messenger RNA vaccines that a lot of us have taken to ward off COVID-19. I think we'll hear much more about the metaverse, but I think the current fascination with the metaverse is probably misplaced. We're, I think, building foundational elements of it. And then decentralization, which I think is going to be talked about a lot over the next year, certainly the next few years, whether that's decentralized finance, new types of social networks that are decentralized that will hopefully mitigate some of the challenges we have with today's social networks, but also decentralized commerce, content distribution, investment vehicles, all different things like that.
Right. So if you would have to find one headline, imagine you would have to find a headline for your new report, what would that be?
We actually do have a headline for that report,
all right,
which comes out in March, and it's reperception. So the theme for 2022 is reperception, which is actually a key characteristic of the work that futurists do. It's looking at signals in the present and thinking about them differently as they unfold. We have been forced to reperceive our situations. Work as we've always known it, the markets as we've always experienced them, people and how we relate to them. COVID has forced us to reperceive our situation, and we think that we're going to start seeing significant after effects of that in 2022.
Right. And what will the outcome be of that?
Well, I think part of the outcome has to do with what our expectations are. Again, I come back to space for just a moment. When we think about astronauts going into space, I think most people imagine NASA or their local space agencies and then the training that goes into that. But actually, next year, the private industry will send more people into space than government for the first time ever. Right? So that's going to force us to rethink and reperceive what the economics and governing structures of space are, which is significant.
Right. So we've talked about this briefly. You are going to publish a new book in February, The Genesis Machine, Our Quest to Rewrite Life in the Age of Synthetic Biology. When I remember, your last book was about artificial intelligence, which was the biggest mega trend then. Everybody was talking about it. So is that now synthetic medicine? Is that the next big thing people will talk about?
So I think it's a parallel or maybe interconnected thing. So when I was researching the last book, The Big Nine, I came across several researchers who were looking at both advanced computer systems and also biology. And in fact, some of the key people in the field of AI were also working with some of the key people in what I would call the wet sciences, right? Instead of the hard sciences or the hardware sciences, this would be like wetware sciences. And that's really what got me interested in diving deeper. So I started this research while I was working on the last book a few years ago. Synthetic biology is a field of science that has been around, I guess, to some degree for a while, but really most of the work has been done over the past, let's say, 10 to 15 years. This field of science involves redesigning organisms to have useful purposes, and doing so in a way that maybe they have new abilities. So it's re-engineering life. And in some cases, scientists are creating fully operational biological systems from tiny parts like DNA, proteins, or other genetic or other organic molecules. Pretty soon, we're going to be able to program cells the way that we program computers. And synthetic systems, organisms, what we're going to create, they're effectively going to operate like biological factories. So I know all of this sounds incomprehensible, but the genesis of this work actually came from Germany, and most people don't know this. The first scientist that ever conducted sort of early synthetic biology research was a scientist named Friedrich Wöhler. He was a chemist in the 1800s, like the 1820s, who figured out how to produce urea, which is the nitrogen-carrying compound that is in the urine of animals. He figured out how to do this by mixing together ammonium chloride and another compound. And it was the first time that a synthetic substance that was still organic had been produced in this way. So here we are in the end of 2021, and there are actually lots of implementations of synthetic biology all around us. And this includes products that range from synthetic ethanol to new types of therapeutics, to even synthetic organisms that are more complete, like a bacteria. There's a scientist in the US who has been tinkering with what he calls a minimum viable genome. He's trying to figure out the smallest potential organisms that can survive and reproduce with the smallest number of genetic components. And the purpose of this is to figure out, how life might have started, and also how to, if you can strip all of life down to the barest number of parts, then what could you build on top of it? So it's kind of reverse engineering things. And as I mentioned earlier, if you've had one of the messenger RNA vaccines, then you've had synthetic biology. That the miracle that created messenger RNA vaccines is not just a once in a lifetime achievement. We're going to use the same technology for other things. So there are already messenger RNA vaccines underway for cancer, for the flu, for all different types of things. Because in a way, this is just injecting new code into your body and telling your it's like reprogramming your body in a way.
Right. You can also...
anyway, so, yeah.
You can also produce chicken meat that has never seen a chicken.
That's right.
Or you can, like, personalized medicine will be possible. Different solutions to climate change. So there are lots of upsides, but also quite a few downsides. A couple of weeks ago, I had a longer conversation with Yuval Noah Harari, who is also working or is interested in that field. And he said that this synthetic biology will somehow be the birth of a new race, because rich people can produce designer babies. That means that they can change the DNA of their kids to make them look better, be more blonde, be taller, be maybe smarter. So is that the birth of a new race?
So listen, I know not a single person who knows me would ever say that I'm an optimist. Okay. I tend to think about worst case scenarios. This is a large part of what I do for a living. But I think in this case, Harari has oversimplified down what's actually happening here to the most salacious parts. Every time through history that we have tinkered with genomes, immediately what happens next is concerns about designer babies. We should have concerns. Designer babies are actually not my first concern. My first concern is a genetically engineered virus for just one person. In the new book that I've written, I explain in detail how former President Donald Trump's security team was really sloppy, and they constantly left behind wrappers of things, napkins. Just his genetic material was everywhere. Anybody could have scooped up that detritus and taken samples from it and created a virus specifically for Trump that would have done something like weakened his liver over time or caused him, a slow but challenging medical issue. And maybe it wouldn't have completely incapacitated him, but it would have done enough damage that he wouldn't be able to think clearly or govern properly, right? That
if he ever thought clearly.
If he ever thought clearly to begin with, yeah. But so yeah, do we have a lot to be concerned about? Absolutely we do. Is designer babies the thing that we should anchor our concerns around? No, not right now. And anyways, if you want to have a conversation about babies, here's something more interesting. In the future, we're going to use some of these technologies to create the material that goes into an embryo from skin cells. And this work using induced pluripotent cells is already underway in lots of countries, and especially in Japan. And the idea is that in the future, I would not need a spouse or a partner to create a baby. I could just use my own material, my own genetic material, a special type of skin cell that can be coaxed into a special type of stem cell that can be coaxed into becoming something else. Which means we could have single parent or multi-parent families. And again, what does this mean in the future? It means we have societal challenges. If you remember the 90s when Dolly the sheep was announced, it was a clone sheep. It was not the devil incarnate, and yet it brought the world to its knees. President Clinton had to have a special press conference to assure people that this was, that don't worry, we're not going to clone designer babies next. I mean, what resulted from that was medication, not demon spawn. But look at what it did to the fabric of society. So yes, there are lots of significant risks that range from viruses being designed for one person or many people, biological experiments that wind up, creating some type of agricultural problem. Kudzu, like what happens if we, something weird happens and we have, those types of issues. We've got biohackers performing their own experiments now. There are lots of problems. I think the biggest of those problems, though, is misinformation. One last thing that I think is important. Years ago, there was a strain of rice that was being developed to help increase the nutritional content of the basic white rice that's eaten in many developing economies all around the world. And long story short, there was a misinformation campaign that equated what these scientists were doing to companies that were intentionally trying to exploit farmers. This was right around the time that Monsanto was under fire. And activists got together and destroyed the rice paddies that were outside that were piloting this new strain of rice, which was going to be given away for free. And it destroyed a lot of the work that had been underway. So there is a lot to worry about. Just as we should not, when we're talking about the concerns of AI in the future, that the real concerns are not killer robots that are going to murder you in your sleep after they take your jobs, right? That's not right. Same thing with synthetic biology. We have to decouple synthetic biology from designer babies because we will miss both the opportunities that are unfolding and the actual practical real world risks that we should be concerned about and preparing for.
Right. We have to talk about killer robots in a minute, but before that, I wanted to ask which innovations in that field should we look at next year? What is mostly interesting? Maybe also on the optimistic side.
Sure. And again, I wouldn't say these are optimistic or pessimistic. They just are, right? So there
depends
are
what we do with it in the end.
Well, it depends. Sure. It depends on, and also your point of view. I'm talking about multi-parent babies, which I see as an opportunity. And some people might think that is horrific. So all of this depends on your perspective. Where are we going to see some changes? 4-dimensional packaging. So imagine a package that responds to some external stimulus like light or, a particular type of heat or cold. 4D packaging could start to replace some of the cold chain, and that would be terrific for some, really bad if you are in a business that supports the cold chain ecosystem. But it'll start to shift what packaging and shipping and logistics look like. So we don't tend to equate biology with logistics, and yet there we are. Additives in food and beverages. There's a molecular whiskey that is out that I tasted.
You don't have to wait for 16 years.
You don't have to wait for 16 years. There's a whiskey out on the market that was created in a lab that basically takes the molecular structure and profile of, a tasty bourbon and recreates it. I would say that the flavor does not have the same depth and richness. I'm a bourbon drinker.
Right.
So it, I'm not going to reach for it as my favorite go-to, but the part that's successful about it is that it's produced and it's scalable. So I think, again, this is the beginning.
One day cheaper than to wait.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So industrial materials, agriculture, a tomato went on sale this year that was created by precisely editing, using CRISPR as a way to very precisely editing genetic traits. So that went on sale. And then, obviously prescription medicine, even new ways to mitigate climate change. So here's another thing. You get a bunch of global leaders together at COP26 and have the expectation that everybody's going to sing Kumbaya and agree and align and leave with, the strictest possible sustainability measures. I mean, why did anybody think that was going to happen? Of course, by the end of it, you were going to have nations that are in different economic circumstances, not want to meet the same stringent criteria as Western Europe and the United States. Why was that a surprise? And also, why are we still trying to address climate change primarily by reducing CO2 emissions? There's 1,000 other ways to address this problem, from solar geoengineering to artificial leaves, which again, you can use synthetic biology to capture CO2 in a totally different way with an engineered leaf that can transform that captured CO2 into a totally organic fertilizer. There are many different ways to approach this problem. And the real solution to climate change is not a silver bullet. It's probably more like a constellation of 1,000 different things coordinated, 1,000 different activities and initiatives.
That's a very interesting point. Let's talk about that for a minute. In Germany, there's a big debate. One group says humans have to change their behavior. That's the only way to solve the climate crisis. And the other group says technology is the only way to solve it. So what do you think?
I think that humans are capricious and we are driven by what's good for us in the moment. And, that is just reality. So if that's the case, and we have competing economic and geopolitical interests, again, does it make any sense that a single solution or two single solutions or something like that is going to be the best way forward? Of course not. But again, I think we have arrived at this place where simplification matters more than substance. Is it more probable that, literally 100 different initiatives coordinated towards the same goal does that have a higher probability of success than getting everybody to align on one thing? Behavioral shifts or CO2, or in the United States, we've got this, punitive system. It's much more stick than carrot. Does any of that make any sense? Of course not. Because what would it make for that to be true? Well, we would have to be absolutely certain that the outcome of just one of the one or two of those initiatives that we pursue is going to be the one that works. We don't know that. It makes much more sense to be flexible in our approach, but that is a level of sophistication that, again, I'm just not seeing. And we haven't talked about geoengineering. China is using a technology to make it rain. And it did that ahead of a very important Communist Party anniversary meeting. It induced clouds to rain. I think it was like a day before this meeting was happening, and the purpose was to clear out the smog. So that's great. It was a beautiful sunny day. On the other hand, I don't think China knocked on Pakistan's and India's doors and said, "Hey, do you mind if we tinker with the weather just so we can have a sunny day for our pretty parade?" We're going to have to figure out ways to use newer technologies in experimental ways that are collaborative. There's another really interesting movement. Some scientists have figured out how to basically over-fertilize the ocean temporarily using iron deposits, which beef up phytoplankton, which then, if they're able to produce, that helps seed some of the natural aquatic life. And they also provide about 50% of the oxygen that we breathe through their own cycle. So that's all well and good. But there's a lot of people in a lot of countries that don't want iron to be deposited in the ocean. And the ocean's, what you do in one part of the world impacts another part of the world. So again, why are we arguing about whether or not we must change behavior or whether or not we must suck the CO2 out of the air when we've got all of these other things we could also be talking about and coming to agreement on?
What do your scenarios say? Will humans eventually be able to not solve the climate crisis, but maybe mitigate the climate crisis?
So at the moment, I would say that there's a lower probability. There's a lower probability that we are going to move fast enough at the moment to address and mitigate the climate emergency that we're in the middle of. And that's because until you have suffered the consequences yourself, in any case, right? In any time that you're dealing with some type of existential crisis that's on the horizon, until you've personally experienced that, it's very hard for you to imagine a future that looks that drastically different from your own. And this is a situation where, as you and I are speaking right now, it's been beautiful. It's like in the 60s in New York. It's going to be Christmas in a couple of days. It's not supposed to be 70 degrees on Christmas in New York City. And the overall amount of white Christmases, so snow, has just been declining steadily over the years, which means that we're more like frogs boiling slowly in water. And, when it comes to climate, and we need something to jolt us into a sense of urgency. And because climate is so tied to politics, which is so tied to personal identity, until people somehow experience the devastation that we're facing, they're just not going to make a lot of changes. So I think I hate to, I'm not optimistic. Let me put it that way.
Okay.
I'm just not. I don't see people changing their behavior. I don't see governments aligning fast enough. And, so what does that mean? That means if I was a business person, I would start thinking through, what are the market needs going to look like in 10 years? I might be the person that invents climate cream instead of sunscreen, right? We're probably going to need not just to block UV rays from the sun. We're probably going to need solar radiation and extreme wind, right? So that your skin does. I do long distance cycling on the weekends, even in the winter. And the wind is it hurts your skin if it's exposed. So I have to put like Vaseline on me, petroleum jelly, just to not have my skin crack. We may have to wear something like that just every day. So at this point, that's what I would be doing, because I don't see a circumstance in which everybody is willing to totally change their behaviors, or every government is aligned. I would come up with mitigation strategies.
Right. So that's indeed a little bit pessimistic. So let's move to another trend I've read in many of your reports. You said a lot about the you of things. So this is somehow the network of sensors and devices that interact with our bodies. Why is that something to be concerned?
So because of COVID-19, we are increasingly working from home. And we're also, and again, developed economies, we're buying devices that keep us connected throughout the day. On top of this, Google, Facebook, or I guess Meta, I refuse to call them Meta, but a lot of companies are launching smart glasses, right? Which will bring an overlay of augmented reality to everyday life. So we've got a lot of devices that we're wearing. Our homes are increasingly full of connected devices. Most of the stuff in my kitchen now has some type of sensor in it, or Bluetooth sensor, or it's got an IPv6. It's inescapable. So this is fine. In a way, it can be useful. On the flip side of this, it means that your smart home itself is creating data. It's generating data, and it's not always clear who are collecting those data. These systems are very opaque. And on the one hand, it means, you could program your refrigerator or your coffee machine to do stuff to set up, things in the morning for you, I guess, for breakfast. On the other hand, it means that you're open to new types of cyber attacks, ransomware attacks. It potentially poses some challenges.
Right. And is that a chance, or is that more a danger to our life? What is the most likely scenario for that?
Well, again, the number of cyber attacks has gone way through the roof in COVID, and that makes sense. When people are not in their offices, where their computer systems are monitored and routers are updated, things like that.
Yeah.
When they're connecting from home, there's just so many more variables. I would absolutely hate to be a CISO or a CIO, a Chief Information Security Officer, or, Chief Technology Officer. I would hate to be that person. And for those of you who are those people, God bless you. You are doing extraordinary work that you don't get any thanks for. The challenge is that most homes aren't secure, and we are bleeding digital emissions and digital data. Now, on the other hand, if you do know how to manage your home equipment, and you know how to partition and safeguard things, then smart homes afford lots of new opportunities. For example, there's a distributed computing network that you can connect your internet-connected devices to. And while you're not using them, you can donate that unused processing time to the network. The network then pools those resources into sort of a supercomputing system that others can rent in order to rent, for big compute intensive processes like rendering, for example. And that's great. And you can get paid. So if you have a digital wallet, you can get paid in cryptocurrency for other people to rent out space on your devices. So on the one hand, that's good. On the other hand, for people who aren't sophisticated and start doing this, again, that's another security risk.
We do have to talk about the one and only biggest trend, I guess, everybody's talking about next year. And I'm not even sure if it's actually big business or just a big bubble. It's the metaverse, this kind of digital sphere Facebook, Google, and all the others are working on. And I was wondering, is that only the next Second Life or really the next development step in the history of the internet?
So I think a better way to talk about metaverse is to think in terms of the foundational layers of what's being built. So we're really talking about bridging physical and digital realities. And when Facebook revealed its glove, which some of you may have seen, it's a haptic glove that you can wear, and then it actually interacts with things in the digital realm. That technology is like 40 years old. Nintendo had that in the 1980s. It wasn't a huge commercial success, but it was functional. So I think part of what we're seeing right now is a lot of, explosive announcements about plans for the future. At the moment, yeah, a lot of this looks like Second Life. I mean, I've seen some of the Facebook demos where you would have your own avatar and you're going to go to a meeting and talk to people. And my question is, nobody at this point likes Teams and Zoom and looking at your colleagues as tiny little squares, but is rendering them as cartoon avatars where you now have to, you know what I mean? Like you've got to push buttons and move around to have a conversation. In what ways does that help your brain? It doesn't make sense.
And it does make you feel dizzy.
It makes you feel dizzy. It also just, again, what's the purpose of a meeting? Most of the time, the purpose of the meeting is to move ahead on something or to be generative or to be creative, right? That's why you get together with other people. So in what way can we reduce friction?
Yeah.
The best way to do that is probably be in person in the same room together. At the moment, the worst way to do that is to ask people to put on equipment and have 15 additional steps in order to replicate some of the same things. So again, at the moment, that's what we're seeing, but that's actually not what matters. So the metaverse, to me, that matters is the spatial computing systems, the opportunity to bring augmented and diminished reality to the masses, and there are business applications. So imagine buying a home in the future, and along with the home that you buy and the blueprints that you might get for the home, you would also get a digital twin of the home. And maybe that's on the blockchain, making it immutable. So you will always have a record of where the electrical system is or was, that kind of thing. Like that part of the metaverse makes a lot of sense.
Sure. What I don't understand, everybody's building their own metaverse now, and it's not this digital world, this digital twin of the world where everybody is coming together in future, right? So it's not one metaverse. It's just like one big bubble, and it doesn't fit together, right?
Right. So obviously interoperability is key going forward. And we're talking about digital spaces. Some of the underlying, like Unity, some of the technologies that are being used are pretty common. But if we think of a metaverse as an operations layer, then yeah, having some amount of interoperability matters. But again, let's extract this out to the broader business community or governing community. Why should you care about metaverse? Because the acceleration of the metaverse tells us that a digital ID is going to be important. Because if people want to hop in between metaverses, they're going to need to preserve their digital identity. And having to manage multiple digital identities is going to be even more challenging than trying to remember your multiple passwords right now.
Right.
Right? So having a single digital ID that confers with it maybe not just authenticating who you are, but giving you the ability to have 10 versions of yourself, an infinite number of versions of yourself that can operate in these digital realms, but is still you, could be incredibly beneficial. And I think the first company that figures that out is going to make a mint.
Apple is working on that, but let's see.
Apple, Facebook, but again, they're closed ecosystems. There's a reason why Facebook is working on that type of system along with its own wallet. In October, they launched a pilot for digital currency and digital wallet. We'll have to see what happens. But this is about containing people in their own ecosystems.
And with this, what we just talked about, the metaverse, another big topic is coming along. It's these NFTs, non-fungible tokens, the digital version of sneakers, of artwork, and people are paying hundreds or thousands of dollars for digital versions of whatever, sometimes millions for digital artwork. Is that actually the next big thing, as some say, or is that just bullshit?
Well, you and I were talking earlier and I said it was bullshit. So maybe let me go broad and then I can go narrow. So for those who are not yet familiar with NFTs, your possibly 3 least favorite letters strung together. A non-fungible basically means that whatever it is unique. So you can't make another one. A €5 bill is fungible. And if you have that €5 bill, you can trade it for another €5 bill, right? And you get the exact same value. In the world of NFTs, this is not the same thing as a dollar for dollar or euro for euro trade. In some cases, some people might be willing to pay more for something if they assign additional value to it. So a non-fungible token, an NFT, is an object, a digital object that is unique because there's only one of it. And mostly right now they're being used to buy and sell and create collectibles, which again isn't totally new. There was something called CryptoKitties a couple of years ago that was experimenting with this. And there was a guy that made this website, and you could buy a couple of pixels, and you could put you could put whatever you want in these pixels. And it was like a one-of-a-kind thing. So this is not new, is my point. But the thing that's different now is that you could do other things with NFTs besides making cute digital collectibles that at some point people are not going to care about. What you could do it with them is establish provenance. So let's say that I buy a luxury handbag or a really great bottle of whiskey or something like that. Typically, those come with some type of certificate of authenticity or ownership, which you could hack, you could counterfeit, and you could lose. Right. So if you lose that certificate, but you still have the object, now it's going to be hard to prove it. So if you had an NFT version of it that only you owned, that would also in some ways function as a smart contract. So that's kind of one interesting implementation. And I think there's also some implementations here for some type of, for some artists, but the market's all over the place. You and I were talking there. I forget the exact amount of money, but somebody made a digital yacht and sold it for like $600,000.
That's ridiculous.
You could argue that it's ridiculous for somebody to make an actual yacht and sell it for $10 million, right? So there's that. If you ever go to YouTube, if you really want to see what people are spending their money on, there's plenty of homes that are hundreds of millions of dollars, and you're just like, what is the point of this? Oftentimes, the point of this is money laundering, right? Mm-hmm. That is why these hundreds of millions of dollar homes that nobody has ever lived in exist. It's a vehicle for money laundering, as are these giant mega yachts, as are, I suspect, some of these very expensive NFTs. So there's that.
Right. So we could go much deeper into that, but unfortunately we don't have the time. Before we wrap up, we promised in the beginning, we have to talk shortly about China. And I was wondering, we did talk about China 1.5 years back. Now let's look again. The regime in Beijing is hitting hard on big tech. What do you think? What is the strategy behind that? And maybe with a broader view, how do you see these tech conflict between the US and China is evolving, and what does that mean for the next couple of years and for the world?
Right. So maybe let me start with the first question, which had to do with China regulating big tech, which seems, a little strange. So here's what's probably happening. Part of China's 5-year plan, the current 5-year plan, is global dominance, or at least some type of hegemony in a couple of key areas, which include 5G and telecommunications, artificial intelligence, and synthetic biology. And at the moment, China's biggest and most formidable players, which include Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent, are doing things like making really awesome, addictive, games that people love to play. What China's basically saying is that it's time to redirect the might of these companies to benefit the musings and the strategic objectives of the CCP. So the regulation has much less to do with breaking up big tech as it does here in the US, and much more to do with focusing the research agendas and the product development cycles of these companies to benefit some of the strategic goals of the CCP. This is important because the BAT, so again, Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, they reach about 90% of the market in China. So there's that happening. There's, in answer to your question about the tensions between the U.S. and China, there is definitely a new era of conflict along multiple science and technology fronts. And this is really a multidimensional challenge because it doesn't just involve technology or regulating technology. It involves, the economy, diplomatic objectives, militaristic objectives. I don't think China established its first military base on the west coast of Africa for fun. I think that they are trying to send a message. And again, I think this is really important, and especially the Africa piece of this. Google, it's really interesting. So Google announced $1 billion initiative in China. It's going to be laying fiber and bringing much faster broadband to different communities for the purpose of building out small businesses, obviously, so that at some point they use Google services. So there's a lot of activity from American tech companies in China, but there's very little diplomatic activity. That is not true when it comes to China. China has been, as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, building bridges, building infrastructure, building digital infrastructure all throughout Africa. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in Africa anyways. Rwanda, which a lot of us remember as being a home to genocide. Rwanda was having major problems not too long ago. Rwanda has emerged as a global technology hub in the middle of all of this. So I think we're going to start to see some of these tech and science conflicts between the United States and China play out in other places around the world, which really puts Europe, I think, in a challenging position.
Mm-hmm. And when you look into the next 5 or 10 years, what will that mean for the position of China? For example, I read an interview recently with the former software boss of the Pentagon, and he said the US already lost in the fight around AI against China, for example. Is that true? Will China be this superior country in all technologies?
I think it depends on the parameters. In the United States, we have 3 epicenters of power. That is Wall Street. That's Wall Street. That is sort of the West Coast. So that's the tech sector from Los Angeles all the way up to Redmond, and Washington, D.C. And often these 3 different groups are not aligned. And in fact, I would argue it's sort of like a 3-sided prisoner's dilemma, where if they just collaborated, they'd all be stronger, but instead they each think they must compete. That is not true in China. And that is China's strategic advantage, because the CCP really has directed its diplomatic, economic, and technological forces to be in lockstep with what the CCP is planning. Now, in some ways, that may stifle innovation over the long term, but there's no question that if China has sights on becoming globally dominant in key areas like telecommunications and 5G and eventually 6G, space. I mean, a lot of these key areas, that they're going to achieve that more efficiently through collaboration. Whereas in the United States, we're very much, we are probably looking at, antitrust legislation and, all just conflict between these three groups. So yeah, I think if you look at it from that perspective, we are behind. And one great part about our government is that we have the ability to elect somebody. The people can elect their leaders every couple of years, but this also creates some instability because it's hard to do long-term planning. If we have, our midterm elections are in 2022, we could very well see a shift back to a mostly Republican-led Congress, and then that creates additional problems. My proposal, I made a proposal for a National Office of Strategic Foresight. Germany actually has something like this at your highest levels of government. We don't in the United States. If we had a National Office of Strategic Foresight that was not politicized, right, so it was politically independent, then that would allow us to do the same type of long-term planning as we see happening in other parts of the world and to execute on those long-term plans over time. In the absence of that, our technology and science gets politicized. That puts us behind China, and it's going to make it hard for us to catch up.
Right. Amy Webb, thank you so much for all these insights. Maybe one last quick question. Is there anything you're optimistic about, some technology you're seeing for 2022 that will be in discussion you're looking forward to, that will maybe make our life easier and better?
I don't know that there's like one thing that I would feel optimistic about, but I can tell you about something that I like. Would that work?
Yes, perfect.
So I sleep in an AI-controlled bed. My bed has a cooling and heating system that's got conduit running through it, and it optimizes my REM cycles while I sleep. And there's a lot of research showing that if you can withstand pretty cold temperatures at night and then gradually warm up, that you just get more restful, basically more productive sleep.
And it works?
So it works really well. I sleep under a 20-pound blanket, which I don't know what the conversion to metric is on that. Yeah. So that's how I sleep. And I also use earbuds that pipe in pink noise while I'm sleeping at night. I recognize this sounds absolutely ridiculous and about the most very privileged, right? I've got all this crazy technology powering my sleep. But I will tell you, I have woken up every day at 5:45 on the dot without an alarm, and I'm getting the best sleep I've ever had in my life. So there you go. Hack your sleep in 2022.
We will definitely try that out. Thank you so much, Amy Webb, for your time, and I hope we will speak soon.
Absolutely. It's our tradition. We should do it again.
Und damit sind wir auch schon wieder am Ende von Handelsblatt Disrupt für heute und für dieses Jahr. Wie immer freue ich mich über Kommentare in der Handelsblatt Disrupt LinkedIn-Gruppe oder senden Sie mir gerne eine Mail. Die Details finden Sie wie immer in den Shownotes. Danke an dieser Stelle auch für die Unterstützung im ganzen Jahr an das ganze Team. Und wenn Sie möchten und grundsätzlich Interesse daran haben, immer auf dem Laufenden zu sein, jederzeit alle Artikel des Handelsblatts zu lesen, Zugriff auf alle Recherchen und Artikel im Archiv zu haben und natürlich auch alle Podcasts zu hören, dann habe ich ein Handelsblatt Disrupt Vorteilsangebot für Sie reserviert. Schauen Sie doch mal nach auf handelsblatt.com/Mehrwirtschaft, wie Mehr und Wirtschaft. Die Details dazu finden Sie aber auch noch in den Shownotes. Jetzt wünsche ich Ihnen einen wunderbaren Start ins neue Jahr, Gesundheit und natürlich immer interessante digitale, aber natürlich auch analoge Zeiten. Ich hoffe, dass wir uns bald wieder hören. Herzlichst, Ihr Sebastian Matthes.